The morning light was soft, the kind that dulled edges and gave the steel in the yard a cold bluish hue. Ronald Joseph Sudo stepped out of his truck, boots hitting gravel with a slow crunch. In his right hand he carried a black metal thermos, worn from years of use. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of diesel and oil, the familiar perfume of the worksite. He crossed the lot at an unhurried pace, nodding to a coworker who waved from him across the yard. The sound of an idling engine rumbled somewhere behind him, joined by the distant metallic clang of chains being moved. He reached a large metal trash container, its hulking size slick with condensation, and ran a gloved hand over the cold steel, feeling for jagged edges. This was routine for Ronald. Check first, then work second. The truck he'd been working alongside idled a short distance away, its paint dulled from years in the elements, with its rear frame glinting faintly in the gray light. Ronald walked its perimeter once, scanning for alignment and clearance, and then motioned to the driver. Now, we don't know exactly what his job was, but he was probably a sanitation worker or refuse truck helper / operator. But whatever he was, the backup alarm on this truck began its steady high-pitched warning tone as the truck crept backward toward the container. Ronald stepped into the gap to guide the driver in, eyes flickering between the truck's slow approach and the stationary mass of the container. The air was filled with mechanical noise, the whine of hydraulics, the thump of tires over gravel, and the constant beeping. Then, in an instant, the rhythm broke. The careful creep became a jolt. The truck lurched backward with sudden force, with the gravel popping under the tires as the tonnage of steel surged toward the container. Ronald had barely begun to twist his body out of the way when the space behind him vanished. His back slammed into the container, the cold steel biting through his jacket, a heartbeat before the truck's massive frame crushed into his chest. The sound was awful, a deep, wet crunch as his ribs snapped inward, shattering like dry sticks. The force drove the air from his lungs in a single strangled gasp. His spine bent violently, vertebrae compressing with a sharp, cracking report. His internal organs shifted and ruptured under the pressure. The trauma was so sudden and complete it left no room for a scream. His right glove slipped from the steel and fell, landing palm up on the gravel. His left hand pressed weakly against the truck's frame, fingers twitching once before going still. The beeping alarm droned on, indifferent to the damage it had just accompanied. Shouts erupted, "Stop, stop, stop!" but the driver, already hitting the brakes, could only watch in horror as the momentum carried on for that last fraction of a second. The hiss of air brakes filled the yard as the truck rolled forward to release the pressure, but Ronald's body sagged as the space opened. His knees gave away first, and he slid down the face of the container, leaving a smear of dark red across the cold steel. He collapsed onto the gravel with a dull, heavy thud. The blood began pooling immediately, spreading between the stones. It was thick and almost black in the dim light. Two co-workers ran to him, dropping to their knees. One pressed both hands hard to his crushed chest, their palms immediately slick and hot with blood. The other shouted in the radio for medics, their voice cracking as they tried to stay coherent. But Ronald's eyes were already glassy, fixed somewhere past the morning sky. His chest didn't rise, his mouth hung slightly open, and a faint trace of blood at the corner. His injuries were catastrophic, ribs driven deep into his lungs, his spine was fractured, and internal bleeding flooded through his torso. Realistically, there was no coming back from this. But the sirens arrived minutes later, their wail cutting through the stunned silence that had gripped the yard. Paramedics knelt over him, working quickly at first, but it was clear within moments. The weight of the crushing force had destroyed him internally beyond repair. A clean white sheet was pulled over his still form. It was 9:40 a.m. Within hours, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had been notified. Their investigation would later reconstruct what happened with cold precision. Ronald had completed dumping a metal trash container and had set it back on the ground behind the truck. While he was still in the narrow clearance between the container and the truck, the vehicle reversed, closing the gap in seconds. The rear end of the truck slammed the container forward, trapping him in the pinch point between two unyielding walls of steel. The investigation determined the cause as fatal crushing trauma, catastrophic compression injuries to his torso and spine. They listed contributing factors: the dangerously tight clearance, Ronald's position with the hazard zone, and the movement of the truck without ensuring the area was clear. Their final note was blunt: employee was killed when he was pinned between a reversing truck and a metal container. In the official record, it was classified as a preventable workplace fatality, basically a death that should never have happened. Ronald Joseph Sudo was pronounced dead at the scene. By June 2004, the beaches of Cancun were packed with tourists from all over the world, including families from the US, eager for sun and adrenaline. The Rivera family had flown in from Miami, and their 9-year-old daughter Sophia had begged for days to go parasailing. It was her first time, and she had no fear, just wide, excited eyes and a smile that stretched ear to ear as she waited for her turn by the dock. The parasailing company set her up quickly. Her harness was clipped in, oversized but secure, and the parachute lay flat on the sand behind the boat. She gave her parents a final wave before the boat throttled forward and lifted her into the air. The rope behind her stretched tight as the parasail caught wind, and Sophia was quickly floating above the ocean, her legs dangling freely, arms raised. She was in the air for less than 2 minutes before the wind shifted. A powerful gust from inland, yanking the parachute sideways and dragging her off course. The tow line began to snap at strange angles. The boat below struggled to correct its heading. Witnesses saw the parasail jerk twice in the sky, then would come a sickening snap. The tow line snapped in midair, clean sharp like a whip cracking. The parachute, now detached from the boat, continued flying, but with no guidance. Wind turned it into a rogue sail, and it pulled Sophia violently toward the shoreline. Her small body swung beneath the canopy like a rag doll. She then began to gain speed, and far too much. Bystanders on the beach would scream. The parasail cleared palm trees and flew over the pool area. It would continue toward the massive concrete structure of the hotel. And now she was completely helpless. There was no way to steer or stop this parasail, and she would strike the third-floor balcony at full speed. The collision was brutal. Her legs hit the steel railing first, with her bones snapping instantly, the sound loud and sickening, like thick branches breaking under weight. The force of the impact drove her left shin completely backward, bending at the wrong angle. Her right femur shattered mid-thigh, with her bones tearing through the skin, visibly protruding, with white streaks stained red in an instant. Her body flipped and her head slammed directly into the edge of the concrete column. Blood would explode everywhere across the wall. Her skull struck with such a force that a crack formed along the side of the balcony. The sound of the impact of flesh, bone, and skull against concrete was heard by near guests who described it as a violent, hollow thud followed by silence. Her left arm folded under her as she hit the tile floor. Her shoulder dislocated completely, the arm twisted behind her, with the socket bulging unnaturally against the skin. Glass from the balcony door shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, several embedded in her right cheek, throat, and chest. Blood would pour from the gashes, mixing with the pool of dark red already spreading beneath her head. It was so bad that a 6-inch shard was lodged in her upper abdomen, pulsing slightly with every shallow breath she managed to take. She was tangled in the remains of the parachute, limbs bent at sickening angles, her face pale beneath the blood. Her mouth was open and lips twitching. She gasped once, blood bubbling between her teeth, and then fell limp. The hotel guest inside the room stood frozen for several seconds before stepping onto the balcony. The sight was grotesque. The child was basically unrecognizable now. Her face was swollen, lips split open, and the skin around her eye already turning purple. Her nose had been completely flattened, and the skin on her forehead had a split in a Y-shaped tear, exposing the bone beneath. The guest, like probably anyone else, turned and would vomit. Hotel staff rushed to the floor within minutes. One maid screamed and dropped the linen she was carrying. Others tried to shield guests from seeing the scene. The entire hallway outside the third floor was dead silent, except for muffling cries and the distant wail of sirens. Security personnel entered the room first, stepping over shards of glass and chunks of broken railing to reach her. Surprisingly, she was still alive, but barely. When paramedics did arrive, they found Sophia clinging to life. Her breathing was wet and raspy, with each inhale sounding like it was coming through a straw half submerged in water. Her legs were almost completely destroyed. As I said earlier, torn skin, shattered bones, and muscles visibly ripped and twitching. One foot had partially detached. Her airway was compromised by the blood in her mouth and throat, and the glass in her neck had nicked a vein, which would make blood pulse out with each beat of her weakening heart. They quickly intubated her, suctioning blood from her throat as fast as it poured in. Her pulse was thready, flickering between 40 and 60. The paramedics could feel her slipping. She was then rushed to the ambulance, trailing streaks of blood down the hotel hallway and into the lobby where stunned guests stood in silence. Her parents followed close behind, her mother sobbing, screaming for someone to help, with her father speechless and numb. At the hospital, doctors assessed the full extent of her injuries. Her skull was fractured in 3 places. She had a severe traumatic brain injury with brain swelling, a collapsed lung, and a punctured abdomen, with multiple compound fractures. One of her ribs had broken and pierced her left lung, which was filling rapidly with blood. The team inserted chest tubes, performed a procedure to relieve pressure in her skull, and tried to stabilize her with blood transfusions. But unfortunately, her blood pressure crashed repeatedly. At one point, her body went into full circulatory shock. Her extremities turned bluish-gray, with her pupils dilated. The ECG readings jumped wildly between pulses, then flatlined, then came back. The trauma team would work for over an hour, but unfortunately, Sophia succumbed to her injuries. Police reports confirmed that the girl's father, Carlos Enrique Torres, filed a police complaint against 4 individuals involved in renting out the parasail service. 2 of them were detained for questioning by Mexican authorities. However, there are no public records of any lawsuit happening, nor do we know what happened to the other 4 guys involved in this. It was a quiet late summer morning in Nokesville, Virginia. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds drifting lazily overhead. On the Vanderwood property, the grass still held beads of dew glistening wherever the sunlight touched. Thomas S. Vanderwood was outside tending to a few small chores. These chores didn't really demand much thought, just moving tools and checking fence lines. The air was warm enough to draw sweat if you worked too quickly, but the slow pace made it pleasant. Somewhere nearby, his youngest son, Josie, was out in the yard. Josie, who had Down syndrome, loved to explore. He could spend hours walking the property, running his fingers through the tall grass, poking at the dirt with a stick, or following the family dog as it wandered. And this morning seemed no different. A distant bark from the dog cut through the silence. Then, faint but distinct, Thomas heard a sound that didn't fit. A muffled splash, heavy and thick, close enough to raise his attention. He would walk towards this noise. At the far end of the yard sat the septic tank, its rectangular opening exposed, the plywood cover pushed aside. As Thomas reached it, the stench hit him first, overpowering like rotting eggs and ammonia burning the inside of his nose. He would then look down. 8 to 10 feet below, the surface of raw sewage was churning. And in the middle of it, Josie thrashed, his mouth opening in a desperate gulp before going under again. His hands scraped the interior wall, leaving faint streaks in the black slime coating the concrete. The liquid closed over his head, bubbles breaking where he had gone under. Thomas didn't pause to think. He swung his legs into the opening and dropped down. The instant his boots plunged into the tank, the foul, thick liquid swallowed them with a sucking pull. Disgustingly warm, and it clung to his clothes like tar. The smell was suffocating, coating his throat and making every breath a fight not to gag. The lava rose to his waist, then his chest, and the resistance was immense, each movement dragging at his muscles. He shoved forward, forcing himself toward Josie, whose face broke the surface again in a coughing, sputtering gasp. Thomas slid his arms under his son's chest, yanking him upward until only his legs remained submerged. Josie choked and coughed violently, sewage spraying from his mouth and nose. Thomas locked his grip, his hands slick with the thick filth clinging to them, and he planted his boots on the slimy bottom. He pushed Josie's head higher, trying to give him as much air as possible. The tank's walls rose straight and smooth above them, no ladder and no grip. The fumes burned in Thomas's lungs. His eyes watered so badly that he could barely see. Each breath was shallow, hot, and foul, with the air heavy with methane and hydrogen sulfide. These gases did more than just reek. They displaced oxygen in the air, starving the body with every breath. Hydrogen sulfide in particular at high concentration kills the sense of smell entirely, striking quickly with dizziness and confusion. Also the paralysis of the respiratory muscles. And Thomas's muscles were weakening faster now, his body burning through what little clean air remained in his blood. The sludge tugged at them both. Josie's body felt heavier with each passing second, his legs kicking weakly, with his head resting more against Thomas's shoulder. Still, Thomas refused to loosen his hold. He shifted his stance and the sludge, the suction tugging at his boots, pulling him down further. But by the time others reached the opening, Thomas was up to his shoulders in the liquid, his mouth dangerously close to going under. They would grab Josie first, hauling him into the sunlight. He collapsed onto the ground, hacking and spitting, his skin and hair streaked with foul water. But when they reached for Thomas, his head had already dipped under. The surface rippled once where he'd gone below. Hands would reach in, dragging him up and out. His body was heavy, water and waste pouring from his clothes in a steady stream. His face was pale beneath the filth, lips tinged blue, and his eyes half opened and fixed. They laid him on the grass, sewage pooling beneath his head and shoulders. Someone began chest compressions, each push forcing thick, foul liquid from his mouth in gurgling spurts. The combination of drowning and toxic gas inhalation had done its work. His lungs had filled with sewage, and the methane and hydrogen sulfide in the tank had displaced the oxygen in his blood, shutting down his brain and heart in minutes. The confined space, smooth walls, and thick oxygen-depleted air made self-rescue impossible. Even with rapid intervention, the damage was irreversible. Thomas S. Vanderwood had given every breath he could to keep his son alive. Josie would survive, but his father did not.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.